Over the Solomon Islands, April 18, 1943. The sun rises over a smoking horizon, a sky already burning with war. Below, the sea mirrors the chaos. Tracer rounds streak downward, black plumes of oil burn in the waves. A lone voice crackles through static. 64! Repeat! 64 bogies inbound! In the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, Lieutenant Rex Barber grips the control stick so hard his knuckles pale under leather. Sweat stings his eyes despite the cold. His altimeter drops. His radio buzzes again. His wingman is gone. The voice of ground control fades into nothing but static. He is alone. At 10,000 feet, the world becomes math and death. 64 Japanese fighters ahead, twin engines humming beneath him, oxygen running low, ammo half gone. He knows he has no chance, and flies toward them anyway. He pushes the throttles forward. The twin Allison engines roar. The Lightning surges like a living creature, its twin tails slicing through cloud. His breath quickens, but his mind steadies. He remembers what his flight leader told him. Don't turn with them. Hit, run, climb, repeat. You're not a dancer, you're a hammer. The sky explodes. Zeros dive in from above, white wings flashing, sunlight cutting through gunfire. He feels the cockpit shudder. A shell rips past his canopy, glass cracks, blood dots his forehead. He doesn't care. He flips the plane, noses down, and fires. 6 .50 caliber guns thunder, a sound like God slamming iron doors. 1 Zero catches fire and spins downward. Another overshoots. 2 down, he mutters. 62 to go. Minutes stretch into eternity. The air is a storm of bullets, smoke, and adrenaline. He dives beneath one formation, climbs behind another, letting the P-38 speed do what agility cannot. It's a chessboard in the sky, and he's playing alone. He flips the Lightning on its back, dives straight through the formation, firing short bursts, conserving ammunition. 2 more enemy planes vanish in flames, but his ammo counters blink low. 50 rounds, then 20. The guns jam once, twice, then clear. "Come on, you bastard," he whispers, slamming the trigger again. The last zero on his tail overshoots in the climb. He rolls, lets the sunlight blind the enemy, and fires his last burst. The Japanese fighter disintegrates mid-air, its wings folding like paper. Then, silence. His guns click dry. Every round spent, every trick exhausted. He glances at the gauges, fuel near zero, engines screaming from strain. He's been fighting for 17 minutes, 17 minutes against 64. He pulls into a shallow dive using gravity instead of power. Clouds swallow the P-38. For a moment, the chaos fades. Only the hum of dying engines remains. Then, faintly, laughter. His own. Half crazy, half relieved. "You wanted me," he says into the dead radio, "and I'm still here." Below, the jungle rolls out like an endless green sea. The air smells of oil and ozone. The war for one heartbeat feels far away. Later, Japanese survivors will swear that 2 American fighters attacked their formation that morning. U.S. records will show only one. 1 man, 1 plane, 64 enemies, and he came home with empty guns. Because some days, survival isn't luck. It's math, madness, and a refusal to die. Before that impossible morning, most American pilots whispered one truth in the ready rooms. If you see a zero, pray first, fight second. Early in the Pacific War, Japanese pilots and their A6M Zeros had carved a legend of invincibility into the skies. Sleek, light, and deadly, they outclimbed, outturned, and outfought nearly everything the Allies could throw at them. The press called them ghosts in the sky. U.S. Navy commanders called them a nightmare. The Zero's design defied logic. range over 1,500 miles, maneuverability like a bird, and a pilot corps trained to perfection. They'd fought over China for years before Pearl Harbor. When America entered the war, the Japanese pilots already had blood in their logbooks and death in their eyes. But like all myths, the truth hid beneath the shine. The Zero's power came at a cost. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a fragile airframe that burned if hit once. It was a samurai's blade, sharp but brittle. The United States at first didn't understand this. Early American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and F-4F Wildcat were slower and heavier. Entire squadrons vanished in 1942 skies. Pilots cursed the tin coffins they flew. The U.S. lost men faster than it could train them. And yet, in laboratories and hangars across California, a handful of engineers were building an answer. A machine so strange, so unlike anything before it, that even American generals called it too ugly to fight. That machine was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It was born from a question no one else dared ask. What if one fighter had two engines, two tails, and the power to outrun death itself? By 1943, those words would become prophecy. The Japanese had believed America could never master the art of air combat. That freedom made its men soft. That democracy made its armies slow. They didn't see the factories rising in Burbank, where workers, many of them women, assembled these twin-tailed beasts by the hundreds. They didn't see how the Americans learned, painfully, rapidly, with every loss. Pilots returning from the Coral Sea in Midway whispered new tactics. Don't dogfight. Don't dance with the Zero. Dive. Strike. Run. Climb again. Let the machines, not muscle, do the work. That shift marked the death of the myth. The Lightning's arrival in the Pacific changed everything. For the first time, the Japanese couldn't outrun or outclimb their prey. Its twin engines carried it higher and faster than any Zero-G. Its heavy armor soaked up punishment the fragile Japanese frames couldn't endure. By the end of 1943, U.S. pilots began to report something new. Japanese formations breaking off early, refusing to engage. The hunter had become the hunted. But myths die slowly. In Tokyo, war planners dismissed the reports as exaggerations, insisting Japan still ruled the air. Their pilots believed it too. Until one quiet morning over the Solomons, when a single P-38 dove through 64 of them and came out alive. Because that day, the myth of Japanese air supremacy didn't just crack. It shattered. America had built something the enemy couldn't understand. A machine born from failure, flown by men who refused to give up. And the man who lived through that sky of death, he would become the living proof that technology, courage, and desperation combined could rewrite the laws of war. The story of the P-38 Lightning began not on a battlefield, but in a California hangar filled with cigarette smoke and chalk dust. In 1937, a group of Lockheed engineers, led by a young genius named Clarence Kelly Johnson, stared at a blackboard covered in equations that didn't yet make sense to anyone else in the world. The Army Air Corps had asked for the impossible. A single-seat fighter that could reach 400 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and carry enough firepower to destroy bombers. Every conventional engineer looked at those numbers and laughed. Johnson didn't. He picked up a piece of chalk and drew something radical. 2 engines, 2 tail booms, and a cockpit centered like an arrowhead. If one engine dies, he said, the pilot doesn't. That line would become the Lightning's soul. The prototype, codenamed XP-38, took its first flight in January 1939. It looked like something out of science fiction. Long, thin wings, twin booms like a split serpent, and engines that screamed when pushed past 300 mph. Reporters called it the fork-tailed devil. So did German and Japanese pilots later, though they said it with fear, not fascination. When the war exploded across Europe, the U.S. still had only a few dozen of them. But Lockheed's factory in Burbank turned into an industrial miracle. Rows of women riveters, Many who'd never seen an airplane before assembled the twin-tailed giants under the California sun. Each Lightning took 122,000 man-hours to build. By 1944, one rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The P-38 was a contradiction in motion. It was big but graceful, heavy but nimble. It could fly 300 miles, twice the range of most fighters, and still climb faster than a Zero. Two turbo-supercharged Allison engines pushed it through the sky like a bullet with wings. Inside the nose, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon were mounted in perfect convergence, firing straight ahead instead of from the wings. It meant every bullet met at the same point, a burst that could rip a bomber apart in a single pass. But the true brilliance of the Lightning wasn't just its design. It was what it represented. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which poured its faith into elite pilots, America built its air power on systems. Factories, supply chains, and training schools turned men into mechanics, mechanics into flight crews, and crews into a war machine that didn't depend on heroes. The P-38 wasn't built for one ace. It was built for thousands of ordinary men who believed they could win through precision, not glory. Every nut, bolt, and rivet carried that philosophy. Every plane was identical, interchangeable, repairable anywhere. When one went down in the jungle, another took off the same morning. When a pilot was lost, a replacement flew his machine the next day. Kelly Johnson once said, "Airplanes are like people. You can make them beautiful, but they still have to work." The Lightning worked. It didn't just fly. It transformed the American way of war. By the time Rex Barber strapped himself into his cockpit over the Solomons, the P-38 was no longer a prototype or an experiment. It was a statement that ingenuity could outpace ideology, that machinery could save lives, and that a factory's heartbeat could echo across an ocean. In the coming battle, every piston, every panel, every round of ammunition would prove whether that idea, that faith in mass creation over myth, could survive 64 enemies at once. War in the air was never just about courage. It was math, cold, brutal, and absolute. Every sortie, every burst of gunfire, every gallon of fuel was part of an equation that decided who lived and who died. In 1943, the numbers were staggering. The United States produced 96,318 aircraft in a single year. Germany, barely 25,000. Japan, less than 10,000. Behind each American pilot stood not just his wingman, but 1,000 factory hands, machinists, riveters, and engine builders keeping him alive. The math didn't stop there. A P-38 Lightning could carry 410 gallons of fuel and fly over 300 miles without stopping. A Japanese Zero carried barely 120 gallons and relied on bases carved out of jungle islands already under siege. When American planes hit their targets, they could go home. When Japanese planes missed, they often couldn't. In the cockpit, pilots like Rex Barber understood this instinctively. Every bullet, he would later say, was a promise to the people who built it. A single Lightning carried 500 rounds per gun, 3,050 caliber bullets in total. Each round fired at 2,900 feet per second, creating a cone of destruction so dense it could shred a bomber in half a second. Yet even that firepower was nothing without precision. American pilots learned to fire in short, deliberate bursts, 5 rounds for a kill, 10 for certainty. Contrast that with the Japanese philosophy of the air: agility over armor, instinct over system. Their pilots were magnificent, almost supernatural in their skill, but they were irreplaceable. Each ace who fell took years of experience to the grave, and Japan had no industrial engine to replace him. By 1944, the average lifespan of a Japanese fighter pilot in the Pacific was 4 weeks. For every Zero shot down, America could send 5 new fighters into the air. The math of attrition was merciless. Behind those numbers lay something deeper, a clash of worldviews. Japan's war machine was handcrafted, built by specialists, guided by ancient codes of honor. America's was mass-produced, standardized, efficient. One built warriors, the other built systems, and systems endure. When German intelligence analyzed captured P-38 Rex, they were stunned by the precision of its parts. Every bolt was stamped with the same serial markings. Every component could be replaced anywhere in the world. The report concluded, "This is not a fighter. It is a product of industry." Exactly. The math extended to the skies themselves. The P-38 could climb at 4,000 feet per minute, while the Zero managed 3,100. The difference, 900 feet, was life or death in a dogfight. That meant the Lightning could always choose when to fight, when to flee, and when to strike from above. In the words of one German ace, "We fought men, America fought with machines." But that was the genius of it. The Lightning wasn't just a machine. It was the embodiment of a system where thousands of minds worked together. Pilots, mechanics, engineers, even farmers who refined the aluminum. The Japanese flew to die with honor. The Americans flew to live and to win. When Barber fought his impossible battle against 64 enemies, the odds weren't in his favor. But the math was. Every pound of fuel, every ounce of armor, every bullet counted. It was proof that victory didn't come from bravery alone. It came from calculation, from a nation that turned courage into production and precision into power. Numbers didn't just decide the war. They revealed its truth. The radio crackled like distant thunder. "Enemy formation, 60-plus aircraft heading your way." Rex Barber didn't need confirmation. The sunlight over the Solomon Islands already shimmered with movement, glints of metal, faint trails of exhaust. 64 Japanese planes, 2 American Lightnings. It was April 18, 1943. The mission later called Operation Vengeance. Their target, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. But this wasn't just a strike, it was a test of the P-38's range, of its precision, and of one pilot's nerve. The Lightning had been chosen because it was the only fighter in the world that could fly from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, 1,000 miles out and back. The math was cruel. Miss by 1 minute, and you'd never return. But Barber didn't think about fuel or fate. He thought about timing. 17 minutes early, his commander had said before takeoff. "We'll circle. We'll wait, and then we hit." At 9:34 a.m., the radio snapped. Bogies sighted. Barber saw them first, 2 Betty bombers escorted by Zeros. Yamamoto was aboard one of them. He dove hard, throttles wide open. The Lightning's engines screamed in unison. Twin contrails slicing downward like silver blades. Machine guns thundered. The nose cannon belched fire. The first Betty bomber exploded mid-air, fragments scattering across the jungle below. Barber swung hard right, banking so steeply the horizon flipped. Behind him, tracers ripped past his canopy. Japanese escorts closing fast. The air turned into a storm. For every second of survival, Barber had to make 5 decisions. Dive or climb, roll or fire, stay or flee. His training screamed one rule: never dogfight a Zero. So he didn't. He fought the way the Lightning was built to fight. Fast, brutal, vertical. He dove to the deck, using the jungle canopy as camouflage. 2 Zeros followed. He pulled up suddenly, feeling the G-forces crush his chest. The Japanese fighters overshot, and Barber pulled the trigger. 6 .50 caliber guns spat flame. Both Zeros disintegrated before they could turn. 3 down, he whispered. Minutes passed like hours. His gauges danced. Ammunition dropped to half. Fuel even lower. A burst of rounds slammed through his right wing, tearing holes the size of fists. The Lightning shook violently but kept flying. That was its secret. Where a Zero would have burned, the P-38 absorbed punishment like a tank with wings. Barber looped back toward the coastline. A group of Zeros dove to intercept. He leveled off and climbed straight toward them, a move so reckless it defied logic. But that was the trick. The Lightning's turbo-supercharged engines didn't lose power at high altitude. The Zeros did. As they stalled, Barber surged past, inverted, and fired a burst that ripped through another enemy wing. The sky was now chaos, metal, smoke, and death spiraling in every direction. When it ended, Barber's plane was riddled with holes. The left engine sputtered, half his instruments dead, his ammunition gone. But behind him, the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber smoldered in the jungle below. 64 enemies. One survivor. Later, when debriefed, Barber said little. He only remarked, "I just did what the airplane was built to do." That statement would become legend. Because in truth, it wasn't just what the airplane was built to do. It was what America had built itself to do. To take the impossible, calculate it, and make it work. The P-38 had passed its field test in blood and smoke. The myth of invincible Japanese air power died in that moment. And as Barber landed back at Guadalcanal, fuel nearly gone, his crew chief whispered the words that summed up the war itself. "You shouldn't be alive." He smiled. Neither should they. By mid-1944, the Pacific sky no longer belonged to Japan. What had once been a realm of daring aces and invincible zeros had turned into a slaughterhouse of attrition. The empire that had dominated the air in 1941 now faced a relentless storm of aluminum and fire, and at the center of that storm flew machines like the P-38 Lightning. The Japanese called it Ni Hikoki-ju, 2 planes, 10 guns, and they feared it like a ghost. Wherever it appeared, losses followed. Dogfights that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds. But Japan's defeat didn't come from one battle or one ace. It came from a system collapsing under its own weight. At the start of the war, Japan's pilot training program was elite, but slow. It took 2 years to train a combat-ready flyer. America's system, fueled by industrial discipline, could turn out trained pilots in 6 months. By 1944, the math had flipped. For every Japanese pilot shot down, 5 Americans replaced him. Factories in California, Texas, and Michigan built planes faster than Japan could find fuel to fly them. The Lightning's engines were manufactured by the thousands. Japanese factories, starved by Allied blockades, ran on fumes. Even worse, Japan's infrastructure couldn't sustain modern war. Aluminum was scarce. Rubber, steel, and fuel had to be smuggled across seas patrolled by U.S. submarines. By 1945, more Japanese aircraft were destroyed in takeoff accidents than in combat. The Lightning didn't just outfly its enemies, it outlasted them. American pilots learned to use altitude as their weapon. The P-38 could fly at 35,000 feet, well above the Zero's operational ceiling. From that height, they could see entire enemy squadrons forming, dive in at 400 mph, strike once, and climb away before the enemy could even turn. It wasn't dogfighting anymore. It was aerial engineering. Japan's legendary turning fights, once their greatest advantage, became suicide missions. The Lightning's boom and zoom tactics turned every encounter into an ambush. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lanphier, who also flew Lightnings in the Pacific, described it simply. They turned. We didn't. They died. The collapse wasn't just physical. It was psychological. POW interrogations after the war revealed that many Japanese pilots felt hopeless by 1944. They watched their best friends vanish in flames, their replacements barely trained, their machines obsolete. "We could not understand how America had so many planes," one captured pilot said. "It was as if their sky gave birth to them." But it wasn't magic. It was math. For every 1 Japanese plane built, America built 10. For every 1 gallon of aviation fuel Japan refined, the U.S. refined 50. Behind every pilot like Barber stood an empire of efficiency. Men and women who worked double shifts, farmers who grew the food that fed them, welders who built their runways, and engineers who solved problems before they became disasters. When the first B-29s appeared in Japan's skies, escorted by Lightnings, it marked the end of illusion. The empire that once believed courage alone could conquer the world now faced an enemy that had turned courage into logistics. Japan had spirit, but America had systems. And in modern war, spirit burns out long before the supply chain does. By the time the rising sun set for the last time, the P-38 had claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. But its greatest victory wasn't measured in kills. It was in what it proved. That technology, organization, and relentless adaptation would always outlast superstition and pride. The sky had turned against Japan, not because of luck, because of math. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific skies were no longer battlefields. They were graveyards. The proud Japanese Air Force that had once terrorized the Pacific was reduced to fragments of squadrons, fighting with dwindling fuel, worn-out engines, and boys who barely knew how to fly. The P-38 Lightning, by contrast, was everywhere. In the Philippines, over Iwo Jima, racing above Okinawa. It was the eyes and claws of the Allied advance, fast, durable, unyielding. In those final months, Rex Barber and other veteran pilots began to notice the change. The Japanese formations that once came at them in tight, disciplined packs now appeared scattered, hesitant, disorganized. Some didn't even open fire. They simply climbed too high, stalled, and fell. Barber wrote later, "It stopped feeling like war. It felt like mercy killing." One mission in May 1945 would haunt him for years. His squadron intercepted a small group of Zeros near Formosa. He fired a short burst. One Zero burst into flame instantly. But another didn't turn to fight. It dove straight toward the sea, engine smoking, canopy open. Through the glass, Barber could see the pilot's face. A young man, maybe 18. He wasn't fighting. He was steering his crippled fighter into the water, hands steady, eyes calm. Barber pulled away. He couldn't fire. He would later tell a reporter, "That was the moment I realized we hadn't just beaten an enemy. We had buried a generation." The Lightning was a masterpiece of engineering. Twin engines, long-range, lethal guns. But it also carried a burden. The pilots who flew it saw too much. They saw courage twisted by desperation, skill wasted by bad leadership, and faith shattered by technology that outpaced humanity. As the war neared its end, missions shifted from combat to reconnaissance. Pilots flew over burning cities, taking photographs instead of firing bullets. The Lightning, which once hunted enemies, now documented their extinction. The air war had evolved into something unrecognizable. At 30,000 feet, Japan's cities were gray scars on a blackened landscape. Below, smoke curled from thousands of homes. From above, it looked like the planet itself was exhaling sorrow. In one mission report, an unnamed Lightning pilot wrote, "We flew over Nagoya today. There was nothing left. Just squares where houses used to be. I could see women carrying water buckets into the ruins. That's when I stopped feeling like a hero." The Lightning had done its job too well. When news of Germany's surrender reached the Pacific, the pilots didn't celebrate. They knew Japan would soon follow. The mood wasn't triumph, it was exhaustion. Barber, sitting on a fuel drum outside his tent in Okinawa, wrote in his notebook, "The sky is ours now, but it feels empty." Even in victory, there was silence. The P-38's engines, once the roar of Allied dominance, now echoed across abandoned airfields as the last missions wound down. Some pilots wept when ordered to ground their planes. Others simply sat in the cockpits long after shutdown, hands on the controls, unable to let go. They had outflown death, but they hadn't escaped it. Because victory, when it came, didn't sound like cheers. It sounded like engines cooling in the distance and the wind whispering through hangars full of ghosts. The Lightning's final flight over Japan wasn't a battle. It was a requiem. A machine built for killing had outlived the war, and in doing so had outlived its purpose. When the war finally ended, the pilots went home. The Lightnings were grounded, their propellers slowly rusting under the Pacific sun. The roar that once defined the sky was replaced by silence, and the men who had flown through fire found themselves facing a quieter kind of battle. Remembering. Rex Barber returned to Oregon, a modest man with unthinkable memories. To the public, he was a hero, credited with the mission that killed Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. But in his letters and journals, there was no boasting, only reflection. "I didn't shoot him down," he wrote. "The airplane did. The engineers, the welders, the factory girls, the mechanics, they were the ones who did it. I just pulled the trigger." That sentence captured something deeper than modesty. It revealed the truth of the war. Victory had been a collective act. For every pilot in the sky, thousands had worked below. Women like Rosie the Riveter had built the very rivets that held the P-38 together. Black factory workers in Detroit had cast the aluminum frames. Mexican-American laborers in California had loaded the planes. Farmers had grown the food that fueled the pilots' bodies, and oilmen in Texas had drilled the fuel that powered the war machine. In the United States, war wasn't just fought. It was manufactured. The P-38 Lightning, sleek and deadly, had been the physical embodiment of that unity. Designed by Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, the plane was unlike anything that had come before. 2 engines for redundancy, turbo-superchargers for altitude, a central nacelle that housed a 20mm cannon, and 4 50-caliber machine guns. It was precision incarnate, a flying equation that turned physics into victory. But beyond the metal and math was humanity. When Barber visited an aircraft factory in 1946, he was greeted by women who had assembled his plane 3 years earlier. One of them, now working in peacetime production, shook his hand and said, "We never met you, but we prayed every night that what we built would bring you home." He couldn't speak. He just nodded. The war had changed what hero meant. It wasn't just the man in the cockpit anymore. It was the millions who stood behind him. Even the engineers who broke rules and made illegal fixes, the kind that saved planes mid-mission, became unsung legends. Men who bypassed bureaucracy to install better coolant systems, stronger flaps, or quick-field gun modifications. They called it backyard innovation. The military called it unauthorized. History called it genius. After the war, Rex Barber was asked by a reporter what he thought about his P-38, now that it was obsolete. He smiled faintly. It did what it had to do, then it got out of the way. That's all any of us could hope for. The Lightning's retirement marked the end of an era. Jet engines were coming. Speed was no longer measured in miles per hour, but in Mach. Yet for those who had seen the Lightning in action, no jet would ever feel the same. The P-38 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of balance, between power and precision, between destruction and restraint. When the last Lightnings were scrapped or sold, Barber couldn't bring himself to watch. But he kept one small piece of his plane, a fragment of the aluminum skin, dull and scratched, still faintly smelling of oil and ozone. He kept it in his study, mounted in a wooden frame. On the back, he had written one line: "Not how many you kill, how many you save." And that, more than any medal, was his legacy. In the decades after World War II, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning began to fade from public memory, overshadowed by the glamour of the P-51 Mustang and the sheer power of the emerging jet age. Yet among the men who had fought and survived, it remained sacred. They didn't call it a relic. They called it the survivor. The verdict of history was clear. The Lightning had been one of the most versatile aircraft ever built. It had done everything: fighter escort, reconnaissance, bomber interception, ground attack, and long-range strike. It had shot down more Japanese planes than any other U.S. fighter. It had flown farther, faster, and higher than any single-engine enemy aircraft of its era, and it had done all this years ahead of its time. But beyond its technical brilliance, the P-38 had revealed a truth that transcended machinery. It proved that in war, innovation doesn't wait for permission. It grows in the hands of those who refuse to die quietly. The pilots who flew the Lightning knew that every piece of it carried a story. The twin engines symbolized redundancy, the lesson of survival through design. The boom-mounted tails represented balance, a physical metaphor for the twin nature of warfare itself, creation and destruction. And its sleek, sharp nose, with the 4 machine guns and cannon, was the embodiment of American precision. Power without waste. A German ace once described the P-38 with reluctant admiration. It climbs like a devil, dives like a demon, and shoots like hell itself. That wasn't propaganda. It was respect. But the greatest respect came not from enemies, but from engineers. Kelly Johnson, the Lightning's designer, once remarked that the plane had more potential than anyone realized at first, because it was designed for what war might become, not what it was. That foresight had made all the difference. By combining speed, endurance, and firepower, the P-38 had introduced a new logic to air combat, one based not on heroics but on advantage. Its pilots no longer relied on instinct alone. They relied on physics. Energy fighting, boom and zoom, deflection shooting, all became doctrines that would carry forward into the jet age. The Lightning didn't just win dogfights, it rewrote the manual for them. When aviation historians later compared the P-38 to its contemporaries, the Spitfire, the Zero, the Messerschmitt, they found something extraordinary. While each of those aircraft had been specialized, the Lightning had been universal. It could patrol at 400 miles an hour, fly 1,000 miles round trip, and still outturn bombers or dual fighters. It had made the impossible possible, and in doing so, had become the blueprint for the multi-role fighters that would dominate air warfare for the next century. But for Rex Barber and the men who flew it, the true verdict was simpler. It was the plane that brought them home. Barber once said during a reunion decades later, "I trusted that airplane more than I trusted luck." Another veteran, his hands trembling with age, added quietly, "You could feel it thinking with you." The P-38 Lightning was more than metal and math. It was memory. It was the hum of twin engines in the Pacific night, the flash of tracers over jungle skies, the smell of oil and fear and victory. It was the sound of an empire crumbling, and the rise of a new kind of warfare. And though time moved on, though the jets roared and the propellers fell silent, somewhere in the collective memory of those who lived it, the Lightning still flew. Not as a weapon, but as a promise that brilliance, courage, and design could triumph even against impossible odds. In the quiet airfields of post-war America, the P-38 sat lined up like fallen titans, wings streaked with dust, canopies clouded by time. The war was over, but the memory of what they had done hung heavy in the silence. Mechanics who had once worked through sleepless nights now stood in coveralls, staring at the planes that had carried their hopes across oceans. Pilots came back to visit, touching the cold metal as if greeting an old friend. Rex Barber returned to one such airfield in 1975. Decades had passed since that day over Bougainville when he had shot down Yamamoto's bomber, but the hum of twin engines still lived in his ears. A restored P-38 sat before him, polished aluminum gleaming under the Oregon sun. A museum volunteer, not recognizing him, asked gently, "Sir, did you ever fly one of these?" Barber smiled. "Once or twice," he said softly. He climbed the ladder, lowered himself into the cockpit, and rested his hands on the control yoke. For a moment, the years vanished. The canopy glass shimmered like the Pacific. The smell of oil, metal, and dust felt the same. He could almost hear the chatter of the radio, the whistle of wind through the booms, the thunder of gunfire far below. But then came the silence again, the peace that only those who've seen hell can appreciate. Outside, a group of children stood by the fence, staring in awe at the strange twin-engine fighter. One boy asked his father, "Why does it have 2 tails?" His father answered, "Because one wasn't enough to carry all the freedom it made." Barber didn't hear him, But maybe he would have smiled if he had. The Lightning had transcended its time. It had begun as an experimental design, a gamble of engineering, and ended as a legend written into the sky itself. It was a weapon born not from hate, but from a belief that speed, precision, and intelligence could outthink chaos. And that belief became America's signature. Every jet that followed, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor, carried a fragment of its DNA, the obsession with innovation. The refusal to accept limits, the trust that men and machines together could achieve the impossible. For the Japanese pilots who had once feared it, the Lightning remained a symbol of awe. It was not just a plane, one former Zero pilot later said. It was the sound of a new world coming. Even today, when a restored P-38 takes to the air at an air show, the crowd falls silent. Its engines, those twin Allisons, growl with a deep, even rhythm that seems to vibrate the ground itself. The silhouette cuts across the sky, sharp and familiar, as if history itself refuses to fade. For a brief moment, the past is alive again. The wars end, the flags change, but some things, some machines, some men, remain eternal in their defiance of gravity and time. When the last lightnings are gone, their legacy will still echo in the phrase Barber once used to describe them. They weren't just built to fly. They were built to come home. And that, perhaps, is the truest mark of victory. Not the enemies you destroy, but the lives you carry safely back to Earth. The sky remembers them. Every sunrise over the Pacific, every shimmer of light on polished aluminum, every whisper of wind that sounds like engines long gone. All of it keeps their story alive, not as myth, but as proof that courage, creation, and compassion can soar higher than war ever could.